And then like there was something like an assembly.
I was feeling the most when we were in the elevator, where I'm like, Jesus Christ, the top of everybody's head. Like 2 weeks, like planning.
Wednesday off, Thursday off.
Daniel's gonna be so pissy.
There's only one slide. No, you will not need distribute. It's a slide with a mouse and a pointer or something.
We're not there. Other thing. Mass notosis. Okay.
Ah, no, that one is comes first, and then what's the next one? Yeah, that's the mouse and pointers.
So which one do you want first? The mass nototis or the other one?
No, the other one, but the other one, yeah, I mean, actually, I can put the blackboard in chat.
Okay, let me put it on the other share screen. See if that works.
Did it go? Sure. Is there a problem with your oh, yes.
There, ink. Ink, 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 ink.
Okay, leave it there. Okay, let's start again. We are now in a chapter learned in the previous chapter. So evolution is a process that consists of two components, variation and selection. What we want to do is we want to, in the end, explain why the universe, the way we know it, is the way it is. We want to explain why there are complex systems like organisms, like planets, etc. We want to explain why that complex. Components, variation, and selection. And let's start with variation. We don't really need to explain variation. Variation just does exchange. They change in any which way. Now, from physics, we know that every atom or molecule universe, it does have a tendency to move, what are called thermal movements, if it's not at the absolute zero. But nothing in the universe is really at absolute zero. That means every particle in the universe moves, and by moving, it bumps against other particles, which means that out of these bumps between particles, things may happen. We have a process of variation. We don't really need to explain. And if you want to go even deeper, we can go to quantum mechanics, and we saw in the chapter on order and disorder that the limit of maximal disorder corresponds to something called the quantum vacuum. The quantum vacuum is the quantum version of emptiness. Emptiness is a kind of a chaos of moving things that change and vary so quickly that we don't see anything of it. So variation, you might say, variation is the basic structure of the universe. Everything in the universe moves, changes, varies. So variation does not need explanation. What we need to explain now is a selection. Why is it that not all variations are kept? Why is it that some variations survive and others are eliminated? So to explain that better, we need to go deeper onto this core concept of fitness. We say that fit systems or fit configurations are selected, they survive, the unfit ones are eliminated. So what does that explain? Well, there is this famous phrase, the survival of the fittest. But actually, as a number of philosophers have pointed out, that phrase can be seen as a tautology. Because what is fitness? Fitness is the ability to survive. So the survival of the fittest is something to say like, those that tend to survive, survive. Yeah, you can say, yeah, is that an explanation? So a number of philosophers have said, well, the principle of natural selection is a tautology. It doesn't give any law of nature. It's something that's so obvious that it doesn't tell us anything. But what I want to argue is that the fact that this is a tautology is not a shortcoming. It's rather a positive thing. Because if something is a tautology, that means it's necessarily true. It means we don't need to justify it. We don't need to explain why there is natural selection. If natural selection is a tautology, then it just has to be there. It can't be anything else. And that is what I want to get at, that is that if we really go to the very foundations, why are these things there? And we assume that variation is there anyway, and if we then show that selection of that variation is something that is tautologically true, then we don't need to explain anything anymore. If we go to the older worldviews, the religious worldview says the universe exists in this form because God created it. But then we would have to explain God. Why is there God? Why did God create it in this way? Why didn't God create it in another way? We still have more question marks than answers. Now, the Newtonian framework is, you might say, more precise in its explanation. It says things exist out of particles that move through space and time according to the laws of nature, etc. But it doesn't explain where these laws of nature come from. Why these laws of nature? Why this space and time? Why these particles? It doesn't really explain that. Well, in the evolutionary systemic world, if we can reduce everything to variation and selection, in a sense, we have explained everything. We don't need to postulate anything that doesn't have any explanation. So that is why being a tautology is good, but then you might still think, yeah, but the tautology is trivial. What does it help me? Well, you can actually say that all the laws of mathematics and of logic, they're all tautologies. They are all things that are true by definition. If I write 1 + 1 = 2, that's a tautology. It must necessarily be 2. By definition, 2 is what you get if you add 1 by 1. And if you add another one, by definition, what I get will be 3. So the whole of mathematics is one big tautology, yes.
I have it very difficult with the difference between tautology and axiom in this form of explanation, because if you explain something and you go from tautology, I think it's very difficult to see the difference between a tautology and an axiom.
Well, you might say that it is a kind of an axiom in the sense that an axiom is an implicit definition of the things that are mentioned in the axiom. So let's say a definition is the most obvious form of a topic. I say 1 + 1 is 2. It's like a definition of 2. 2 is what you get if you add 1 + 1. Now, axioms in mathematics, they involve more than one or two different concepts, but they specify this concept implicitly. It's kind of an implicit definition. So, well, let's not go into that there, because then we're getting into a pretty tricky part of epistemology. But axioms are kind of tautologies in the sense that they are implicit definitions of the things you are using. Let's take some other examples of tautologies or axioms, if you want. In logic, we say that A and not A cannot both be true. In a sense, that is a definition of what is not A. Not A is whatever is false when A is true, and whatever is true when A is false. That means that the two together can never be true. It's a tautology. A cannot be at the same time true as not A. It's tautological because it's kind of a definition of what not means. Not means that it's false whenever its opposite is true. Now, these kind of statements, which could be an axiom from logic, they are tautological, but they allow us to build up a whole formalism, mathematical formalism, logical formalism that can derive theorems, and these theorems, they are typically very non-trivial. Mathematicians, they spend years thinking about how to prove a theorem, and once they have proven it, you might say, okay, all the steps that they made in that proof were tautological, they were necessarily true. That's kind of the definition of mathematics. From A follows B, from B follows C, from C follows D. Therefore, if I assume A, then D must be true. That's what mathematicians are doing all the time. But the results they get, they will agree, everything but trivial. What a tautology like that, or like 1 + 1 = 2, what it does is actually it makes a statement where you take something on one side and something on the other side, and saying that they are the same basically means that you can represent them in two different ways. I can represent this entity as a 1 and a 1, or I can represent it as a 2. It's two different representations of the same phenomenon, but one representation is typically more useful in my present context than the other. Instead of writing 113, I could make a list of all the ones that go into 113 and put 113 ones. Obviously, this is a much clearer representation. I can do much more representing it like that and representing it like that. It's like the old number systems. You still see it partly in the Roman numbering system. Instead of writing 6, you write that, and instead of writing 3, you write. It's obviously not as handy as our representation. So you might say that the whole of mathematics and logic is developing representations that are more easy to work with, easier to represent things, easier to make inferences from, easier to understand things. And that's actually also what the tautology of natural selection does. If we speak about survival of the fittest, what we are saying is, if something is fit, it will survive. If something continuously survives, then it is fit. But fitness and survival, they're looking at different aspects. Survival is what happens on the long term if you follow that thing. If you speak about fitness, you're thinking about something that has the right properties to survive in a particular environment. So a fit thing, if you think about in terms of fitness, you can start making all kind of reasonings. We gave the example of the giraffes and the long neck. One thing that is tautologically true is if an animal survives for many generations, it is fit. So I have an animal that eats leaves, that lives in the savannah, and I know that it survives already for many generations. So now I can start reasoning. So that animal must be fit. In order to be fit, it must get enough food. I know that it eats leaves. I know there aren't many leaves in the savannah, except in trees. But trees are tall, so it must have some way to reach these tall trees. So maybe either it can climb into trees, or it just a very long neck and very long legs. So starting from these assumptions, I can start reasoning. It's a little bit like a mathematician, let's say, or let's say a physicist who knows a lot of mathematics will start to look at a particular phenomenon in the physical world and then start to say, well, if I put that into a mathematical framework, I can describe it with this and this geometry and these numbers and write an equation that relates these numbers to these numbers. And if I use that equation now, I can calculate that this and this will happen. But an equation, it's something like this. Something is equal to something else, and the two things are different representations of the same phenomenon, but the one representation allows you to make calculations, the other one not. So fitness is a little bit kind of a similar concept. And to make the connection with mathematics, well, sometimes it's useful to write fitness in a mathematical form, and then you get something like this. And I better write it down as a division to be clear. So the fitness of some system or state S is equal to the number of that S at a later time, t plus 1, divided by the number at the present time, t. What does that mean? If t is the present time, t plus 1 is the next generation, I'm looking at the number at the next generation, I divide it by the previous generation, and then I get a number. If that number is equal to 1, it means that there are as many in the next generation as there are in the old generation. It means basically the population remains the same, the system is fit, it survives. It survives, but that's all. Doesn't increase, doesn't decrease. If the fitness is larger than 1, it means that the number of animals or the number of systems at a later time is larger than at the previous time. It means it's increasing in population. It's doing particularly well. Maybe let's say that, let's look at an historical example. At a certain moment, maybe somewhere in the 19th century, some people introduced rabbits in Australia. There were no rabbits in Australia, but those rabbits, they did very well in Australia. They multiplied and they became a pest in Australia. So in the environment of Australia, these rabbits turned out to be extremely fit. So they had an F much larger than 1, which is why the rabbits became a pest in Australia. But maybe some other creatures in Australia were not as fit, and once that those rabbits started eating all the grass that these other Australian creatures were eating, their population started decreasing because they couldn't compete with the rabbits, so the F was smaller than 1. So you see the definition of fitness, we can in principle make it in a mathematical form, because it doesn't mean that it's easy to calculate. And it rarely happens that they make calculations like it, because typically fitness is much more complicated than the kind of thing that physicists look at. Physicists will look at simple properties like speed and temperature and amount of heat. That's doable. Fitness, in some cases, you can describe it mathematically, but yeah, in most cases, you will have to think in a more qualitative way. So let's reason in this more qualitative manner. So to be fit, your number should at least not decrease. So not decreasing in number, how can you achieve that? Survival, most obvious one. If you die quickly, then your number will decrease. So you need the ability for survival. But it would also be good if you can increase in number, if you can multiply. And there are in principle two ways to multiply. The most classical one is reproduction, like an animal or a plant produces offspring. So it multiplies by making, in a sense, copies of itself, copies with small variation, but making copies of itself. That's what happens in biology. But in principle, you could also multiply the numbers by making them again from scratch. That doesn't happen in biology. You can't have organisms emerging out of non-organisms, but in physical systems, snowflakes, crystals, molecules, they are formed anew. So you could say a particular type of molecule is very fit because it's constantly formed anew. Let's take the CO2 in the atmosphere. There are lots of processes that are producing CO2, and we as humans in particular are helping many of these processes. So you might say CO2 is a fit molecule, but it's maybe not as fit as oxygen or nitrogen, because in the atmosphere there's much more oxygen and much more nitrogen than CO2, because CO2 also gets absorbed by plants. So CO2 is maybe not the fittest molecule. But we will, of course, more speak about organisms, because that's where mostly the theory of evolution is applied. But in principle, you could use the notions of fitness also for things that are not living, that are not reproducing themselves, but that are multiplying simply because you make more of them. Now, you could have intermediate cases, things that can both reproduce and be formed anew. And one nice example is if you have a liquid water in which you have dissolved salt, so it's salty water, and you let that liquid dry out, the concentration of salt will increase as the water evaporates. At a certain moment, the concentration of salt will become so big that salt crystals will start forming spontaneously in the liquid. So that's a form of spontaneous formation. But you can accelerate that process if at the moment that your solution is almost saturated, that means that it almost has the maximum of amount of salt in it. If you then drop a crystal of salt in it, that crystal of salt will start to grow because the salt that's in the liquid will tend to attach itself to the crystal that's already there. So here we have an example where the salt crystals can kind of reproduce, but they can also form anew. So it's just to say that this notion, reproduction versus spontaneous formation, are intermediate cases. But generally, the rule is for organisms, we speak about reproduction. For non-living things, we speak about spontaneous formation. So we have, in principle, three different methods to achieve fitness. Surviving as long as possible, reproducing as quickly as possible, or being spontaneously generated as quickly as possible. So we will not speak anymore about the spontaneous generation because then we're getting into physics and self-organization. We want to more focus on biology, living organisms. So we have these two strategies, survival and reproduction. So now, in principle, you have a choice. Will you focus more on survival or will you focus more on reproduction? And then we get a continuum, which is often called RK selection. But the more, let's say, modern term is fast and slow life history. Can you show the next one? So these two creatures illustrate the two strategies. The mice reproduce very quickly. Every, I don't know, 4 or 6 weeks, a mouse has babies and typically several babies. So generation after generation, if those mice wouldn't be eaten by all kinds of other creatures, the whole world would be covered in mice so quickly that mice reproduce. On the other hand, we have the tortoise. Tortoises reproduce very slowly, but tortoises live very long. Mice don't live long. In captivity, a mouse might maybe live 1 year or so. In nature, most mice are eaten by all kinds of predators, by foxes, by birds, by cats, or they starve, or they drown, or mice are pretty vulnerable. So why these two strategies? The mice live in an environment that is very dangerous for them. There are, as I said, lots of creatures that like to eat mice. Mice are not very strong. Mice can't really protect themselves. Mice need a lot of food because they are very active. If they don't find enough food, they die. So mice are vulnerable. That means if, as a mouse, you want to be fit, you should make sure that you have as quickly as possible offspring and as much offspring as possible because most of those offspring will anyway die. So it's the idea, if you have enough offspring, there will always be 1 or 2 that survive, and like that, you can survive the different generations. So mice use the so-called R strategy, the fast strategy, the strategy of reproducing as quickly as possible, but knowing that your life will be short. Some other creatures that follow the R strategy, well, bacteria, they typically reproduce very quickly, but there are all kinds of things that kill bacteria. Weeds, like all these kind of plants that whenever you take away all the grass from a patch of earth, you will immediately have a number of wildflowers like chamomile that start growing there. These plants are very good at spreading their seeds and at going very quickly to take in any patch of land that was cleared. But as soon as a little bit bigger plants come, these plants disappear. The chamomile will not survive as soon as there are a few bushes or some bigger grasses because the chamomile can't compete with these other plants. So the other strategy, tortoises are there, elephants are there, humans are there. Humans reproduce slowly and humans live very long compared to a mouse. The same with elephants. Why is that? Well, what do tortoises and elephants have in common? Basically that they don't have predators. No lion can kill an elephant, but a lion also can't kill a tortoise because the tortoise just has its shell. The tortoise, if some predator tries to attack it, it gets into its shell, and it's very hard to kill a tortoise. So the case strategy, the strategy of long life, you can afford to do that if you live in an environment that is intrinsically safe. If you live in an environment that's intrinsically risky, like the mouse, then your only way to achieve fitness is to reproduce as quickly as possible. Reproducing as quickly as possible, that has also one of the disadvantages is that if there is a lot of offspring, they need a lot of food. But then if the food runs out, then most of them die. So that works in environments where the amount of food is variable. If, let's say, there is, suppose that you're a rabbit, you're living in a region with grass, you're eating grass, and it hasn't been raining in weeks, there isn't much grass, there isn't much food, and then suddenly it rains a lot, and suddenly there's a lot of grass, your food supply is very variable. In such cases, it pays to follow the R strategy. Yeah.
So the R strategy also fastens selection, right? Because the generations are quickly dispersed, genetically, blah, 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 blah. But then the slow life history, you said it was safe. And is it then also a lot more stable because they don't have as many generations and thus way less selection, so it has a stable evolutionary state?
Well, the evolution will be slower inherently, yes, but normally the evolution has become long enough that the tortoise has evolved to a very stable shape. But now the interesting thing is that the case of the mouse, we know that it lives in a dangerous environment. It's most likely to be killed before it reaches old age. But even if you keep a mouse in a perfectly safe environment in a cage, you feed it, you give it everything it needs, mice still don't live long. Because they also age more quickly, it's because their body is specialized in putting all its energy in producing offspring. It's not specialized in keeping the body alive in repairing all the damage from aging, while the tortoises, they live long. There's a nice illustration of that principle. There is a species of opossum that lives somewhere in North America, and there are two varieties, one living on the mainland and one living on an island close to the mainland. The difference is that on the island there are no predators. On the mainland there are predators. That means that the ones on the mainland live more in an our style of environment. They have a more risky life. The ones on the island have a more case style of life. And even though it's the same species, they're not exactly the same, but you can still cross them, so they're still the same species. If you keep them in captivity, the mainland ones will die sooner than the island ones. It's because the island ones have developed this case strategy. They have been selected for being able to live longer because they could afford to live longer. There are no predators. Therefore, they put more effort into developing their body and keeping it healthy, while the other ones, there is no sense in having all these repair mechanisms to keep your body fit as long as possible, because anyway they are likely to be eaten. So another aspect of the case strategy is that in a case situation, the organism is aimed at the long term. That means it invests in having its offspring grow slowly, take the time to grow big, to grow strong, to grow experience. While the other one, the R strategy, the mice doesn't make much sense for a mouse to learn lots of things or to grow very strong, because anyway it's going to be eaten soon. Which is what you typically see, that The ones that follow the case strategy, like elephants and people, they're bigger typically, they're smarter, they live longer, but they are more slow in reproduction. There was a question.
Is this also applied to humans in social studies?
Exactly, that's what I'm now going to come to. R and K is usually applied to different species, but as I gave the example of the opossum, even within the species, there can be some that are more on the R and the case. And even if they are exactly the same species, there is a possibility to choose, you might say, the R or the K strategy, choose it in the sense that it's not programmed in the genes, but that it's a reaction to the environment. And there have been anthropologists who have applied it to people, and the reasoning is if, as a human, you live in an environment that is risky, that is dangerous, you will subconsciously tend to follow an R strategy. If, on the other hand, you live in an environment that's pretty predictable, that's pretty safe, you will unconsciously tend to follow a K strategy. And where do we see that effect? Well, we see the effect in the difference between people living, let's say, in Congo or somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa and people living in Europe. What we see is that people living in Europe live longer than the people in Congo. Their life expectancy is much longer, but they have much fewer offspring. So there seems to be this kind of a trade-off. When your life becomes safer and longer, there is a tendency to have less children, and vice versa. When your life is risky and likely to be short, you tend to have more children. Now, it's not a conscious calculation that those people do. One hypothesis, which seems plausible, is that it would have to do with hormones. That if a child lives in an environment that's kind of dangerous, it would have a lot of stress hormones, in particular the hormone cortisol. And that exposure of that to that hormone in youth would lead to more sex hormones, estrogen for women, testosterone for men, which would make you do the kind of behavior that leads to quick reproduction. Yes?
So is this also applicable to trauma then? If you've had a lot of trauma as a child?
That might well be. I think there the research is less obvious, but that might well be. But what we do see is that people within a country, if you have groups that are, let's say, more oppressed or poor or in worse circumstances, that it's typically those groups that have more children and that also have lower life expectancy. So, for example, in the US, this might be the blacks or the Hispanics. In Eastern Europe, this might be the Roma, the Gypsies. In Western Europe, these may be Muslim immigrants. You typically see that these groups, which do less well on the socioeconomic level, tend to have more children and tend to live less long. Now, the less long living kind of makes sense if they're living in worse circumstances. But the having more children, if you would think about rationally, you would think somebody who's living in a very safe situation, who has all the money he has, that person should have more children. But it's typically the opposite. It's the poor people that tend to have more children. Yeah.
Francis, how does this change with cultural evolution? Because there's kind of a third category, even though it's sort of the third, like with stories, for example. So another way to survive is to become a story, right? That you just get carried by other people. You don't need to do the reproduction yourself. You get other people to repeat you. Or if you're a meme, for example.
As a meme, yeah, okay.
Meme story, right?
Okay, yeah.
So this is somehow like a third category. But then also thinking about like mimetic evolution, some of the fastest reproduction now is happening in, say, the Silicon Valley or the West, right? Like, or in science, like in terms of like really fast reproduction of memes,
Oh,
and yet that would
well, yeah,
suggest that it was in a precarious situation, because if it wasn't in a precarious situation, it would be looking for the longevity of its ideas, but actually it's like reproducing AIs faster and faster.
no. I think I see. I think I see indeed a good example if you look at, let's say, you could apply that to knowledge. You have knowledge that survives long but reproduces slowly. Let's say the theory of general relativity, very solid theory. It's there already for more than 100 years. It hasn't really changed in these 100 years. It's a very serious, well-confirmed theory, but very few people learn it because it's a difficult theory. Now take the latest fad or the latest rumor or the latest conspiracy theory in the present circumstances. It will reproduce very quickly. People will send it to one to the other, and then probably 1 or 2 years later, it will have dissipated. You might say in the present environment, things are very risky for memes. You don't know what will be the newest news. So you better develop the properties of spreading quickly. It's not very risky to build a theory that you know that will still be there in 100 years. At this moment, it's maybe not the obvious strategy. So you would rather want to have something that's very flashy that people will immediately spread, than something that maybe take time for people to learn, but it will still be there in 100 years. Okay. So these are two important dimensions of fitness: reproduction versus survival. There are two more dimensions. That is the dimension of what I call internal fitness and external fitness. Now, I used to teach this course in Dutch, but there is not really a Dutch translation of fitness. And the word fitness is very appropriate because the word fit in English has actually two meanings. You have one meaning which is similar to the meaning in Dutch, which is being fit means being strong, being robust, being in good shape. But you have another meaning of fit in English, which is being fitting, being suited, being adapted. Like you can say that those trousers fit me. That means that they nicely fit around your body. So when we're speaking about fitness in evolutionary terms, we need both things. We need something that is intrinsically robust, which I call internal fitness, something that will not easily fall apart, and something that fits its environment, that is suited, that fits into its environment. Some examples of the second term of fitting means fitting relative to the environment. A key fits into a lock. The key needs to have the exact shape that it can enter the lock. A molecule that is being used by the body as a signaling molecule, that molecule must have the right three-dimensional shape to fit in a particular receptor on the body. When you're making a jigsaw puzzle and you have a piece and you see where it fits, you put it in the right place. So that is the sense of fitting, as having the right shape to fit in a particular part of the environment. And the particular part of the environment in which a system fits, we call a niche. So niche is a term which originally comes from biology, but actually it can be applied to any evolving system. A system to be fit needs to find a niche. That means it needs to find some subset of the environment in which it will find all the things it needs to survive. So an example of a niche, if you are a marsupial in Australia and you eat plants, well, one plant that is very common in Australia is eucalyptus trees. So if you would be able to eat eucalyptus leaves, you would have a lot of food. The problem is eucalyptus leaves are poisonous for most animals, but not if you're a koala. So koalas are perfectly adapted to live in eucalyptus, and that's basically all they do. They eat eucalyptus leaves. They hang somewhere in the tree on a branch, and they just take eucalyptus leaves, chew on them, and swallow them. And basically, they're the only animals that can do that because eucalyptus leaves are very undigestible and poisonous for most animals. But if you manage somehow to evolve a digestive system like the koala has that can digest eucalyptus leaves, you have found the perfect way to survive. There are plenty of eucalyptus forests. You're high up in the tree, so you don't need to have much fear of predators, and you have all the food you need. So koalas are what we call specialists. They have found pretty limited niche where they have everything they need. They fit in there like a key fits into a lock. But take the koala out of the eucalyptus trees, drop it, for example, in a forest in Europe, and the koala will not survive long. The koala fits perfectly in this very specialized niche. Now take a different kind of animal, like for example a rat. You can drop a rat almost anywhere on Earth, and the rat will survive. The rat is not specialized. The rat is a generalist. A rat can eat almost anything. That's how rats, originally coming from Europe, have entered ships that were going to all parts of the world, gotten out of these ships and conquered all these different islands and continents, and now there are rats everywhere. So a rat is a so-called generalist. A koala is a specialist. What are the advantages and disadvantages? Yes?
A rat is then internally very fit, and externally it doesn't need to be fit because it's internally very fit.
Which one?
A rat.
Yes, you could say the rat is internally fit in the sense that it has the ability to adapt to lots of different environments. While the koala is dependent on this one environment, but within this one environment, that koala is, you might say, the master. There is no competition, while rats are competing with lots of other animals that eat the same kind of things. But where we are now. Yeah, good. So that's the difference between the specialist and and the generalist way of life. Okay, let's go because they will need to.